Oh boy, this weekend was a banger. We had Kagaribi 9, a 1,248 attendee tournament in Japan. With some of the best of the world in attendance and what is considered the strongest average player base, this tournament was one of the hardest brackets that Smash has ever seen. The top 8 featured some familiar names like Acola, Asimo, Yoshidora, Ken, and Zackray, as well as some unexpected twists such as 9's Mario, I'm Sheik, and Zackray playing Pit, who I promise is not a good character. Do not believe the lies. Now, I've analyzed the top 8 so that you don't have to. Let's get into it.
What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
Trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
For every set in the top 8, I've identified a theme. Fair warning, this is my personal interpretation, and it might not align with the player's intentions. However, I feel like this is a great insight into some aspects of play that make the Japanese scene so strong and so consistent on a global scale. If you enjoy this content, show me that you want to see more by liking and commenting. You guys crushed the previous like goal. So for this one, let's try to get to 500 likes. And if we get there, I'll be doing another review for Collision 2023, the upcoming major in the beginning of March. Let's get into this top 8 analysis. So, for the first round of losers, we have 9's Mario versus Hero's Bowser. I've been told it's pronounced Hero. I'm going to stick to that pronunciation for this video. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. Anyway, let's get into the theme for this set, and it is about the styles of information gathering. And the reason why I choose this as a theme is a little bit complex, so let's start at the beginning. I think one of the most important things in Smash, obviously, is gathering information. You want to make informed decisions, right? It's kind of like in RPS, the first round, you are more likely to play around rock because men are more likely to pick rock, right? So in RPS against another man, you would be more likely to pick paper. It's a bit of metagaming, right? So we have this information about likely options, and that is going to inform our decision making. Now, in a game like RPS, where all the outcomes are equal, having that small advantage is huge. This translates very well to Smash, though it gets a lot more complex. So to simplify it a little bit, I identify 3 main styles of information gathering. I call them commitment, coverage, and movement. So these all exist on a bit of a spectrum where the more committal an option, the more relevant the information, right? So when we see Hero play, he will commit a lot to his options, but that also means that he gets very relevant information every single time. Let's say Hero does a jump in forward air. What really are your options in terms of stopping him? You could interrupt him, you can, try to shield it, you can try to roll in. It kind of stops there, right? You can whiff punish. So there are very limited outcomes. So the quality of information is very high, but the risk is also very high. That is committal information gathering, what Hero prefers, and also something that Bowser is quite good at, because once he gets that information, the punishes that he gets off of that information, the leverage is insane. On the other side, we have Now, who focuses more on coverage-heavy information gathering. Now, coverage is a lot less committal, which also means that the information you get is a lot less high quality, right? The quality, well, the actionability of the information is less extreme. So when we think about, for example, Now covering the airspace by whiffing a back air, what could Hero have done about that? Well, he could have not done anything. He could have dashed back. He could have rolled in. He could have jumped away. He could have tried to whiff punish. He could have tried to contest. He could have shielded. There's so many things he could have done about it, including just not contesting at all. In other words, the outcomes are very varied, which means that the information is harder to parse, right? It is more it is less binary information. Then the final option that I discussed was movement, which, as you can imagine, it's the least committal option, but also the least intensive in terms of information gathering, right? When you're moving, your opponent's not really forced to do anything. There's a lot of possible outcomes. If you want to see movement-based information gathering, I recommend watching a little bit of Tweak. He's really, really good at that. Anyway, back to this set, we see that in a lot of these early games especially, Hero controls the match by forcing information gathering around his committal playstyle. Now, the thing about this committal playstyle is that while you control a lot of the information, like we said, you also incur a lot of risk. So you're also giving your opponent a lot of information. And we see throughout this set that Now gets better and better at reading into these commitments, at using that information that's given. And this is a very natural progression of these styles. The committal style might be explosive. It can come on really, really strong as you grab control over the game through your committing, through the information you get off of that. You capitalize. But as the set progresses, more patterns come up, and the player who was more coverage heavy, who's taking less risks, can adjust his coverage to cover for the risks that you're taking, to find that balance between covering multiple of your styles of commitment at once. And that's exactly what Now does. As he improves and improves throughout the set, we can see him wait for these committal options. We can see him preemptively beat them out, and eventually he takes the win over Harrow and advances. In the other side of losers, we will be looking at I'm versus Zackray. And for this set, we'll be talking about the importance of ledge drop in ledge traps in the current meta. So one of the most important positions in advantage state is ledge trapping. The reason why is because it's the state that a lot of advantage states lead to. So let's say you're juggling someone. If your juggling is on point enough, oftentimes you will force them into the corner or even towards the ledge. So when you're juggling someone, if they're safe, they go to the ledge. If someone is off stage, if they're safe, they go to the ledge. If you corner someone, you hit them, you put them back on the ledge. So your ledge traps is basically a bottleneck in terms of your advantage. So being able to get off the ledge is extremely important in the current metagame, as people are getting safer and safer and using that ledge as a safe haven more and more often. Well, the more unsafe you can make it, the better. And Zackray has been doing extremely well in terms of making it safe for himself with the use of ledge drop. So the reason why ledge drop is important is because it's an unreactable option, right? Normal getup is reactable, roll is reactable, getup attack. The attack itself is not reactable, right? But it is very committal. And while a ledge jump is great, it does lead into a juggle, right? You ledge jump, the person ledge trapping you can juggle you. And because you're in the corner, there are relatively few areas where you can land, right? If you drift all the way to center, that makes your drift relatively predictable, right? Because drift is additive, right? You go forward and then you continue to go faster forward, which limits your options in terms of going backwards. Now, if you keep your landing ambiguous, that means that you don't have a lot of options because the entire space behind you is not really like landing area, right? So let's jump is getting worse and worse, and we've seen an increase in ledge rolls to kind of like counteract the way that people are capitalizing on ledge jumps, but ledge drop really is the natural evolution of the current meta. And what we see from Zackray just in a singular game is that his mix-ups from ledge are insane. We see drop nair, drop fair, drop double jump down B. We see side B mix-ups. We even see drop double jump air dodges. And all of these options, they mix each other up very well. Now, for a character like Pit, this makes a lot of sense, right? Because Pit has an extra double jump, right? So he gets to recover quite easily, as well as a very long range up B. Though a little bit vulnerable, a character like Sheik does not often kill Pit for recovering with a B. On the other end of the spectrum, we see I'm trying to do a very similar thing, and it makes sense because Sheik as well has really good options from ledge. She can do her drop double jump forward air being fast, having extremely low landing lag, being a 5-frame landing lag aerial, one of the few in the game, and comboing as well, right? So giving I'm a lot of reward if it works as well. Plus having a good hitbox overall, just one of the better aerials at getting off the ledge. On top of that, if you do interrupt Sheik, she has her down B and up B to make it back to the stage. Now the issue here is that Zackray focuses from the get-go on denying I'm his ledge drop double jump aerials, using, for example, Pit's forward tilt and other options to stop I'm from getting off the ledge. So what we see here is just an insane advantage just through this one bottleneck. And this is really the most important takeaway here, is that if you can win a core situation in the game, like for example mid-range, right? Or in this situation, coming off the ledge, even though it's just a singular situation, because so many other situations transition into that singular situation, it is extremely key. And again, what we see from Zackray here is just an insane set of mix-ups from the ledge, great usage, and it makes it so that I'm like Sheik as a character as well relies a lot on her advantage state to get her damage, right? She gets her combo takes a lot of hits and then puts you on the ledge. And then from there, what Sheik does is the most important part, because this is where she gets her kills, right? Think about Wicked Nair into Bouncing Fish, up tilt into Bouncing Fish, using needles, hitting you out of your jump when you're ledge jumping, right? And then from there, getting her gimps. All of those are extremely important win conditions. So Zackray not just playing to the meta really well, but also abusing a bit of a, well, not a weakness, but again, a bottleneck of Sheik's gameplay, and using that to get his win over Aim, advancing into the next round.
高さと健康確認どちらも取ろうとすると難しいところそのコンボミスにつけ込んだ
So, Yoshidora versus Asimo, two of the best players in Japan right now, and both playing characters that love to play up close. And if you remember from my previous video, the Genesis 9 analysis, we talked about the terms. And the terms, the TLDR for the people who haven't heard, the terms is basically when both players are looking for a similar situation, oftentimes the player that wins the situation is the player that creates that situation on their own terms. So for example, let's say you're playing Ryu versus Steve, right? They both want to be up close. So the person who wins up close is often the one who creates the situation in their own favor. So for example, Ryu getting a jump in there into close range pressure, or Steve making Ryu whiff and then coming in with a whiff punish up tilt and then again up close pressure. So the terms of engagement are really important. Now in this matchup, Yoshi definitely has more control over the terms. However, the issue is that Yoshi has to be pretty preemptive about establishing the terms. The movement that Yoshi commits to can be, well, committal. The character is floaty, the double jump lasts for a long time, and a lot of the moves that Yoshi use, they stay out for a while as well. So if they use it preemptively, yes, they get the safer later hit of the move, which also often combos better, right? Like think about a late hit Nair going into Imagination, but it is also more commitment. So Yoshidora uses continuous movement to try to find an opening in Ashimo's game plan and use that to kind of like establish his own terms and pressure / mix Ashimo up with the command grab, with the aerials, with the movement in general, right, left, right, spacing, no spacing, etc. The thing about that is that what Ashimo is doing is very smart. Ashimo basically has two answers to this strategy. So the first one that Asimo uses is extremely preemptive defensive swings. Ones where he realizes that Yoshidora is not moving yet, so he gets the time to set up, for example, a short hop back air. Now, if Yoshidora directly engages, he gets stuffed out. Big weakness for Yoshi, of course, is that range, and in this case, Asimo disincentivizing direct engagement. Now, Yoshidora, again, relying on that movement. The answer that Asimo has for that is to wait for the point of commitment. In other words, there's a point at which Asimo can confirm certain movements and adjust his options according to that. And because Yoshidora, again, has to use relatively big movements to avoid Ashimo's aggression and try to establish his own terms, Asimo can simply wait for that point of confirmation, that point of commitment, and then at that point, he makes a very informed reactionary decision and intercepts Yoshidora's attempted establishment of the terms. So in this case, we see that committal nature of the movement really come out, and Asimo making great use of it. Now, there is a big counter for this for Yoshidora, because here's the thing, right? If Yoshidora commits immediately, Asimo swings with his defensive swing and Yoshidora loses. If Yoshidora waits too long to swing, Asimo gets to react, and on that point of confirmation, he confirms what he has to do and picks the right option. Now, the issue is Yoshidora never directly whiff punishes. We don't really see him stand there and dash attack Ashimo's preemptive swings. Because Yoshidora focuses so much on moving around Asimo, he never really focuses on that time mix-up, right? He's so focused on the space dynamic that he doesn't really focus too much on the temporal aspect of this matchup. So again, what I would like to see in the future from Yoshidora is a little bit more of direct whiff punish. Of course, Yoshi's dash attack, not the greatest, but it is a whiff punish, right? And the grab as well leads into advantage state. Extremely important against Ryu and Ken due to their air stats as well, to just put them in the air and go from there. So Asimo really countering Yoshidora at the core of Yoshidora's intentions, and through that establishes a very dominant victory over Yoshidora, advancing into winners. Moving into losers, we got Ken versus Zackray. And there's a lot to be said about this dynamic. We have a jack of all trade characters from Zackray playing Pit, whereas Ken relying on a very extreme character in Sephiroth. Now, I would say that Sephiroth's extremes actually lead to him being very well-rounded, right? So for example, his lackluster frame data usually would lead to him being relatively weak against interruption, right? Interception. However, because of his range, he actually can stop you from interrupting him very well. So the theme of this set then becomes this lesson. Sometimes weaknesses are simply lack of strengths. So instead of Sephiroth easily being interruptible, it is more the fact that he cannot easily stop you from interrupting him that becomes the weakness. So in other words, you gotta not always look at what someone is weak at per se, but also how someone's middling options can become weaknesses when exploited. So the opposite of this would be to capitalize on Pit's range. So Pit's range is not a weakness. His range is pretty solid. However, compared to the way that Ken plays to Sephiroth's range, Pit's range is lackluster. So what we see from both of these players is that instead of really capitalizing on these huge character weaknesses that neither really have in terms of play patterns, instead both of these players, they're trying to create weaknesses through exploitation of middling options. Now, what happens when these weaknesses get exposed is that both players start to rely more on middling options to compensate for these weaknesses, right? So when Pit starts to win a long-range war with arrows, Sephiroth tries to use side B to get through the arrows. However, side B really is not all that. So either player are really neutralizing some of the strengths by focusing on those middling options. And when both of the characters' power level goes down, what it really relies on is a lot of the player read as well as the average outcome. And what we see was that Zackray really focused in on that average outcome. In terms of his risk reward, I think his risk reward management was far superior to Ken in this set. And while Ken held his own through some great callouts, and especially in Wing where Pit really cannot control the pace of the match, right? Ken really found some of the plays that he had to. At the end of the day, Zackray was just a little bit too solid every single time. And that is what caused Ken to fall, and Zackray to continue his run with Pit. Moving to the other side of losers is Yoshidora versus Now. And this kind of builds upon our previous point a little bit more. This time, more specifically, the theme is that you want to base your defense around your opponent's shortcomings. And through that, force commitments. So why is this so important? Well, in a game like Smash, that as its essence is RPS, right? Rock, paper, scissors. Everything you do has a counter, and all of the options to some degree are double blind, right? The best way to win RPS is to react to what the opponent is doing. In other words, if the opponent is committing first and you get to react. Now, what you find is that in a lot of top level play, a lot of the players will focus on trying to get the opponent to commit. Now, good players will not commit out of nowhere. So how do you force that commitment? And that is where we talk about this defensive approach, right? You want to base your defense around your opponent's shortcomings. So let's say you're playing against a Yoshi. Where does Yoshi lack the most in their offense? It is mostly in terms of range, which Mario cannot abuse, and the lack of significant reward on grab. There is the command grab, but that is relatively risky, right? Overall, Yoshi can struggle a bit to open up shields. So when you use a lot of shield, Yoshi has the answers, but the answers are committal, right? It's things like empty landing, in other words, not putting out hitboxes, which makes you more vulnerable. It is things like command grab, which if you spot dodge or roll once or jump over, Yoshi's very, very vulnerable. So by focusing on your opponent's weakness, you force them to commit to compensate for that weakness. And that point of commitment, that is where you get your openings. Now, Yoshidora does the same to Now. And what Yoshidora does in this set specifically is he relies a lot on hitboxes, right? So in a lot of ways, the defensive play from Yoshidora is about outranging Now. Now, Yoshi doesn't necessarily outrange Mario in a significant way, but combined with the speed, the range advantage is there. So both of these players, they try to basically make the opponent commit first. It's a game of chicken in a lot of ways. What we also see is that this playstyle leads to some limitations, especially for Now, who relies a lot on shielding. If you're in shield, you are inherently limited in your movement. Vertically, there are still some options, right? You can jump, full hop, etc. But horizontally, you're mostly restricted to rolls or having to drop your shield. And what we see from Yoshidora is that Yoshidora uses his movement to basically outmaneuver now and say, well, you can shield to mitigate my offense, but what if I don't try to be too offensive here? What if I mix up the timing of my offense because you're limiting your movement? So in other words, while you can use tools to shut down your opponent's game plan through trying to make them commit, in a lot of ways, you are committing yourself as well, and it leads to patterns. And these patterns are what Yoshidora abuses. Now, the flip side here, which is also interesting, is that Yoshidora's offense is limited due to shield, but the way he's limiting Nao's offense is a lot more varied, right? So like we said before, he's using hitboxes and movement to outmaneuver Nao. Now, movement inherently has an insane amount of mix-ups, plus the timings as well as the drift combined with the hitboxes that Yoshidora is using allows him to shut down Nao's offense through abusing that weakness of range while still being flexible enough to not rely too much on patterns. So what we really see is an increase in flexibility throughout the set as Yoshidora gets a grip on what Nao is doing defensively. Yoshidora, of course, has a lot of experience with the specific weakness of Yoshi and knows how to beat it without having to commit in the first place. Again, turning it into a bit of a game of chicken and saying, well, now you can defend, but how long can you defend for before you get antsy? And we can see that Nao is kind of baited to get out of these shield situations, and then when he is stuck in shield and he's baited to get out, he only has so few options to move, to mix up, and that is where Yoshidora really strikes hard and advances further into the bracket. Continuing into the realm of defense, we have Acola versus Asimo. And if you want to talk about the terms, again, it's a huge part of discussion in this analysis. We got a lot of close range versus close range fighters in this top 8. Now, Asimo has a very specific way of establishing or negating Acola's terms, right? Establishing his own or negating Acola's terms. And that is his use of shield. And I understand why. If we think, again, about a weakness for Steve, is that he can struggle to straight up beat shield. His grab is a tether grab, and while the reward is great at lower percents where he gets a combo, eventually the reward really does fall off, and being wrong against Ryu with a grab is extremely debilitating. And I think what we see in this set is just how much control you give up when you start relying on shield, and that is something that Steve has that other characters don't. It's that ability to throw out hitboxes while moving on the ground, right? So if we think about control, usually the significance of giving your control is very much related to the significance of distance between you and the opponent. So what do I mean by that? Well, think about a character like Young Link, right? Who functions at close range, at mid range, and at long range. If you shield, the significance of shielding is a little bit less important because whichever way your opponent positions, you have answers to combat that. Whereas a character like Ryu wants to be up close. So let's say you shield and the opponent uses that room to create distance. That is a huge loss for Ryu. Now, what we see from Acola, again, is his ability to move while throwing out hitboxes. So other characters, think about like a Cloud, right, relies a lot on back air. The reason why is because when you're doing aerials, you can move while doing a hitbox, which allows you to mix up your positioning while having a hitbox out. That's very unique. Steve can do this as well with up tilt and jab. So what we see is that when Asimo is shielding, Steve can throw out hitboxes in case Asimo plays aggressively while repositioning in case Asimo relies on shield. And we see this a lot from Acola, who positions his hitboxes always in a way to counter direct aggression while also shutting down excessive shield usage. And this is not just like jab and up tilt on the ground, it can also be an auto cancel back air, which Acola is definitely one of the best Steves in the world at using, right? That auto cancel back air, it auto cancels very late into the jump, so the back air still hits grounded opponents while also auto canceling, leading to a very safe aerial. At the end of the day, this set is kind of a clean sweep for Acola exactly because of this. Asimo tries to establish his own terms and negate Acola's terms through the use of shield, and Acola from the get-go has the answer to that ready, and through that clean sweeps Asimo. However, as we're going to see later, Asimo has some adaptations in his bag of tricks for grand finals. First though, let's move on to losers finals. Acola sitting pretty in grand's winner's side. Moving into losers semis, it is Yoshidora versus Zackray. A very, very interesting matchup. Yoshi's versus Pit, something that you would never see this late into a bracket in the Western scene. And we actually didn't expect to see this in Japan either, but here he is, Zackray, rocking the Pit, making it all the way here. And I think this, again, lets us build upon a point that we talked about in a previous analysis, and it is about that movement in the air as well as your mobility on the ground. So I think Yoshi, as a character, very limited in his ground game, right? Very much an aerial character. Now, the nice thing about Yoshi's air game is that because of his maneuverability, it is not as committed as most air games. However, there's one little bit of a caveat, and that is that you cannot shield in the air. So in that sense, there is still a huge vulnerability, which a character like Pit is actually really good at abusing, right? Pit is really good at doing, for example, like a jump in nair, using the disjoint as well as the movement, the precise movement from the ground to position that nair properly and anti-air you. So what we see is that the theme of this set is the importance of ground game, because it's not like Zackray is on the ground all the time. It is the interplay between ground and air game. And in the example that I just described, we can see this in action. So let's dissect it a little bit. We talked about Yoshidora being unable to shield in the air, right? And Zackray using grounded movement to then set up an aerial move. And this is the core interplay that people should strive for as they rise through the skill levels. What I mean by this is that oftentimes what you see at top level play is that they treat their ground game purely for positioning. It's not like they're moving somewhere to hit someone. They're moving somewhere because on the ground you can move at a lower commitment while also having more options available to you, because from the ground you can always go into the air, as well as having one of the only frame one options in the game, which is shielding, right? As well as all the options that come from shielding. So on the ground, you can move into positions at a relatively low commitment cost. And from there, a lot of the time, again, at top level, what you see is that they move on the ground and then they enter the air from there, and then they use their drift to mix up their movement further. In other words, a core component of top level play is the flexibility of movement, of always making it hard for your opponent to understand where you're going to be. And what you find then is that at top level play, people will start to hit you not where you are, but where you could be, which is again something we talked about in the previous set with Acola placing his hitboxes in places Asimo could be, and if he wasn't going to be there, he would be safe due to that, you know, that property of Steve, that movement. So when you see people start to aim for where you could be, what's better, being on the ground or being in the air? That's where being on the ground becomes a lot more important. So that ground play is really, really movement heavy, whereas the air game is more about, well, one, covering yourself while moving, right? So what you see, for example, from Acola especially, but also Zackray, is that they will use retreating jumps while doing like a rising aerial, because the aerial acts as a sort of replacement shield to protect them as they move, right? But mostly the ground movement is used for that movement, and then the air game is used to capitalize on the position that you just gained. Now, of course, it's not like ground moves are never used, but the ground moves, they are more of a reactionary tool, right? So think about like a forward tilt whiff punish from Zackray, right? That is just very committal. Think about a dash attack, that is very committal. And even some of the tools that we traditionally see as less committal tools, think about something like a Roy down tilt. Roy down tilt feels very uncommittal, right? Very low commitment. However, you're still staying in the same position for at least 20-ish frames. And that might not seem like a long time, but that gives your opponent a moment to react to your current position, know that you are going to be there by the time they finish reacting, and then plan their actions based on the possible situations that could result from that. Whereas if someone dashes, by the time you react to the dash is long over. In fact, they could have done 2 dashes by the time you react to a singular dash, which means that while someone is moving on the ground, you cannot react to their exact position. And you're always, in a lot of ways, you're always at least 10 frames behind, because a dash is about 10 frames and you react in 20, right? So by the time you react, they're already 10 frames further into a possible future. Whereas in the air, because the possible positions out of being in the air are so much more limited than the possible positions out of being on the ground, it is a lot easier to, like we talked about in the Yoshidora versus Asimo set, you can confirm a certain moment of movement and from there make a very informed decision, especially a character like Yoshi, who unfortunately has a lackluster fastfall due to being a little bit floaty, right? Fastfall is a multiplier, so oftentimes floaty characters fastfall a little bit less fast than fastfallers themselves do, as well as having a subpar double jump, right? If Yoshi had Chrom double jump, his air game would actually be a lot better, in neutral at least, in terms of mixing up his positioning, because suddenly there's a range of vertical mix-ups that become more accessible. So what we see is that Zackray is a lot better at keeping his movement unpredictable and converting that unpredictability into good situations, while Yoshidora has to commit harder because he prefers to be in the air so much. And from Zackray, this mix of ground, air, right? Using the ground game to move flexibly, using the air game to commit on that, or, like we said before, using hitboxes to guard himself while he moves through the air. Those are all very, very powerful aspects of this set. And as a small aside, this is pretty interesting, but Pit, one of the few characters who does have a shield in the air in that down B, which makes his air game a lot less committal than other characters do, as well as having multiple jumps, which again adds a lot of vertical mix-ups. So we even see when Zackray does take to the air, he has some advantages that Yoshidora doesn't have, and we'll see more about that in the next set, which should be Asimo versus Zackray. But for now, let's celebrate this victory from Zackray, rocking that pit, shutting down a titan of the Japanese Smash scene, Yoshidora, and advancing to the next round.
N 着地通ったライン回復はどうする高い勇気の前からセクンだ横押し横押し高いダメージが通ったがダッシュ攻撃
So for losers finals, we got Asimo versus Zackray, Pit versus Ryu, and I think this is another story of a turnaround, right? Because we have Zackray going up 2-0 and then Asimo making the 3-0 comeback. Now, this means that there's usually a important dynamic going on that gets figured out, that gets flipped around, and I think in this case it is about shutting down movement paths. So again, building upon what we talked about before, where we said, well, when the meta advances, people start focusing more on movement and being unpredictable in terms of where they are, and in reaction, the opponent will start hitting where you're supposed to be. Well, it is pretty bad to hit where your opponent is going to be if that is a commitment, right? So let's say the opponent focuses on defensive movement. If you want to call it out, well, you have to overshoot a dash attack. Extremely a committal thing to do, not something that's going to consistently get you into the top cut. So what do people do instead? Well, they shut down what I call movement paths. And movement paths are generally like ways for people to position themselves strongly. So we talk about creating strong situations all the time, but strong situations are also related to where you currently are. So by entering into a position that makes it look like the opponent can react by creating their own strong position, allows you to make it more readable, more predictable where your opponent is going to position themselves. Now, what we see from Zackray is that he's extremely strong at doing this, as we saw against Yoshidora, where he used that ground game to position himself and then transitioned that into extremely strong aerial control. In this case, it's not necessarily the interplay between ground and air game, it's more so Zackray trying to shut down Ashimo's movements into that close range, because, well, a big weakness for Ryu is that there's only so few ways that he can enter the close quarter situations. The issue with this is the preemption required, because while you can position yourself with low commitment on the ground, you eventually have to shut down a movement path preemptively. Like we said before, a dash is like 10 frames. You cannot beat that on reaction. If you're reacting, you're too late. So if you want to shut down a movement path, you have to cover defensively, right? So what we see from Zackray is him covering spaces while retreating or while being spaced extremely well, often a combination of the two, and then using that to deny Asimo his entry into close quarters. Now what Asimo does is he flips this around by understanding this dynamic, and that is where Zackray kind of struggles to adjust. And the reason why is that Asimo basically lets Zackray shut down a path, but while he's shutting down a path, he is not spacing on Asimo. And Asimo uses that room to instead set up a little bit of pressure. And here's the thing, he doesn't actually get hard punishes, right? It's not like he shuts down this preemptive swing by overshooting a dash attack or doing like a Tatsu. Instead, he just slowly corners Zackray and says, well, you're going to have less and less room to work with. And eventually this again evolves into a game of chicken, where the question is when is Zackray gonna try to get his space back? Because what essentially goes on here is that we have a war around a resource, and that resource is stage control. And Zackray is spending stage control to strike at possible movement paths. And eventually the resources run out, right? Eventually he gets into the corner and there's no more stage control left. What happens then? So Zackray has a choice. Every single time he swings, he can either spend the resource or he can try to get more of the resource. And what we see is that this balance is entirely in Zackray's favor early on, until Asimo catches on to some of the patterns that we see from Zackray in terms of retreating especially, and then says, well, Zackray, if you continue doing this, you're eventually going to be all the way into the corner and you have no more resource left, which means that, you know, you're cornered. You get corner pressured by Ryu. It's a bad time. So what we see from Zackray is that as the set progresses, he gets more and more antsy to not get cornered. And these preemptive swings are something that Asimo, again, with that shield usage, makes great use of. And from there, he leverages a win. Something that is very important in this dynamic that we got to keep in mind is that, well, Asimo, yes, we saw this against Acola, right? He relies a lot on shield to keep himself safe while he advances. The issue is, shield is only a bad thing if the opponent uses that room to pressure you somehow. And Steve has this, this quality of mining where if you're not pressuring him, he is winning, right? So Steve naturally shuts down Asimo's shield heavy playstyle by making distance and mining. However, Pit doesn't really have anything like that. So for Pit to win with the room he is given, Pit will have to establish his own pressure. And that is where Zackray struggles. Zackray does not want to commit to that type of pressure too often because, again, if you're wrong against Ryu, you do tend to lose. And that is where we see Asimo win the mental war in the long run, not get agitated, find solutions, and cause Zackray to get frustrated and feel helpless. And the commitment, they keep piling up until Asimo takes home the win and gets his rematch against Moving into the climax of the event, grand finals, it is Acola versus Asimo. They fought in winners finals, which was kind of a wash in Acola's favor. However, Asimo does manage to win grand finals number 1, and it is through a very simple concept. We talked a lot about what you should do, why you should do these things, thinking about good situations, thinking about creating these, thinking about shutting down your opponent from creating them, all sorts of RPS. And what Asimo teaches us in the first set of grand finals is that when is often more important than what. So you can know exactly what your opponent is going to do, but if you don't know when they're going to do it, how do you stop them? If you're too early interrupting someone while they're moving, you could be committing preemptively and getting whiff punished. If you're too late, you're giving them time to set up the good situation. There are a lot of variables, not just in what you want to do, but also when you should be doing it. Asimo in this set really creates these pauses in his gameplay to give Acola room to commit first. And here's where he turns the table. We talked before about how Ryu is not super scary in terms of burst range, right? He can create these good situations, but he doesn't often win a situation from mid-range. It's not like a Greninja or Pit, he hits you with dash attack, he wins the situation. More often than not, Ryu wins the situation by creating a good one, right? So from the mid-range, he jumps in, gets a good situation. So what he does instead in these mid-range situations is he gives a little bit of a pause because, surprise, surprise, Steve can also struggle with doing this from the mid-range. So by adding this little bit of a pause, he's not taking too much risk, because for Acola to actually win the situation from that pause requires quite a bit of commitment. And as we've seen before, Acola doesn't want to commit. As we saw, he played very defensively around these possible approaches while covering Asimo relying more on shield. Asimo now relies a little bit less on shield and adds a little bit more of these pauses, right? Because when he's shielding, these pauses don't mean a lot because he's so limited. So he doesn't shield. Instead, he approaches and he creates these pauses, knowing that if Acola wants to punish him for doing so, Acola generally has to commit decently hard. And what we see is through this structure, as well as some early kills that Asimo found and picked up very well, Asimo gets the win in grand final set 1. Afterwards, we move into grand finals set 2. And Asimo starts to set off with another dominating victory, right? Taking the first game, but then Acola switches gears. And this is where we get into the theme of our final set for this video. And the theme is RPS options are not created equal. So we see Asimo, he stops shielding. We see that Asimo starts adding these delays into his gameplay. And all of this is to mess with Acola's rhythm, right? To basically say it doesn't matter what options you pick, the only thing that matters is when I do it. Right? So in the second grand finals, Acola says, well, Asimo, you made a lot of adaptations on a psychological level, right? So on a psychological level, he is stopping the shield, right? So he's throwing Acola for a loop. He is adding these pauses. In other words, like adding a pause on paper, it's not good. The risk reward is not great. Your reward is low, your risk is high. These are all adaptations that only work because of the psychological aspect of Smash. And Acola says, well, let's throw all this off of the table. Let's just play good RPS. Let's just play the game without the influence of all of these psychological factors. I'm just going to pick options that are objectively good. And through doing that, he finds all of these high reward situations, all of these high reward conversions. And through that, he takes a very solid victory over Asimo in the second set of grand finals, a 3-0 and a dominant one at that, after dropping just a single game and picking himself up in a huge way. So taking a look into the Japanese meta shows us a very different prospect than what we're used to in the West. And I think that really is the most interesting part of this video. The Japanese focus on safety and lack of willingness to commit leads to good play patterns and bad play patterns. I think what we've seen in this top 8 is a healthy mix of both, but especially some of the weaknesses. I think the reason why the Japanese scene is seen as such a strong scene on average is that focus on safety, which a lot of the mid-level players in Western scenes don't have, leading to them being a lot easier to exploit as players. Whereas in Japan, exploiting a player takes a few extra steps because you got to get them out of that comfort zone, out of that defensive play first, which can be hard, right? It can be very, very hard given certain matchups. So on the other hand, we see the top level players in the West, especially, the American continent, we see them outperform their Japanese counterparts relatively consistently. And a big part of that is because they are more willing to take risks. They're more willing to commit when needed. And that is the essence of a game like Smash, is that you gather information ideally safely, and then you apply that information into smart commitments, smart risks. And I feel like the Japanese playstyle can be a little bit too focused on how do I converge into a more safe playstyle, something that is more consistent, something that has very little variety, or I should say very little variance, right? And that small amount of variance is a good thing in most of the bracket, but when you start entering top 8, it gets worse and worse. That is not to say that Japan is weak. I think Japan is absolutely the strongest scene in the world right now, but for them to really establish the top level dominance, they would have to start taking more smart risks and think about how to convert information into actions more intelligently. Of course, they play a lot of characters that have to do a little bit less of this. Think about the way Asimo plays Ryu, very defensive, right? Very much focused on how do you open me up, not how do I take smart risks to open you up, which ended up being his downfall. As well as Acola, again, playing a character that's just inherently a very defensive character. So we see the top Japanese players succeed with these characters because it fits their playstyle. And again, I think, let's be fair about this, I think there's something to learn both ways, right? Japanese players have things to learn from the Western scene, and the Western scene has things to learn from Japanese players. However, for now, this is going to be it. Another top 8, another set of interesting lessons and themes. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to support the channel, and of course, stay smart.